On a crisp, sunny afternoon in the heart of the city, the streets were bustling with life. Tourists walked around, taking pictures of the impressive landmarks, while locals went about their daily business. Among them was a royal guard standing tall at his post, his uniform immaculate, his face stern and unreadable. The guard was one of many responsible for watching over the royal residence, a job that required extreme patience, discipline, and an unshakable sense of duty. The scene was a typical one in this busy area, but today, something was different. A man, loud and unruly, stepped onto the scene. He walked down the street with a visible sense of arrogance, his face twisted with anger. His dog, a large, intimidating breed, walked beside him, its eyes scanning the crowd with a sense of protectiveness. The man was quick to start shouting, his voice cutting through the chatter of the people around him. His words were sharp and disrespectful, aimed at anyone who crossed his path. He seemed intent on creating trouble, deliberately provoking those he passed by. As he moved closer to the royal guard, the atmosphere shifted. The guard stood motionless, a perfect figure of authority, his eyes trained straight ahead. He did not acknowledge the man's presence, focusing solely on his duties. The man, sensing the guard's refusal to engage, grew angrier. He started to shout directly at the guard, his words mocking the soldier's disciplined silence. The man's taunts were loud, and his anger was evident. The crowd around them started to notice the commotion. Some looked on nervously, unsure of what might happen next. Tourists whispered to each other, while a few locals stepped back, clearly uncomfortable. But the guard remained unfazed. His posture never wavered, and his eyes stayed fixed ahead, a testament to the rigorous training he had undergone. He had faced moments of tension before, but nothing seemed to rattle him. The man, clearly growing frustrated by the guard's silence, took another step closer. His dog growled, sensing the tension in the air, and the man turned to it, giving a command. The dog's ears perked up, and it began to bark loudly. Its eyes locked onto the guard. The man's intention was clear. He was trying to provoke the guard, hoping for a reaction. The crowd, now more aware of the situation, began to hold their breath. The air was thick with anticipation, unsure of how the guard would respond to the growing threat from the dog. People muttered among themselves, wondering if the guard would take action or simply stand his ground. The man, however, wasn't done. His words became more direct, his tone mocking. He continued to taunt the guard, daring him to move, to show any sign of weakness. But the guard stayed silent, unmoved by the provocation. His eyes never flickered. He did not look down at the dog or give the man the satisfaction of seeing any reaction. The crowd's murmurs grew louder as the tension escalated. Everyone was waiting, unsure of what would happen next. Would the guard respond to the man's cruelty, or would he maintain his calm? The dog barked louder, and the atmosphere grew thicker with unease. In that moment, all eyes were on the royal guard, wondering how far the man would push him, and whether the guard's incredible composure would be enough to stop the chaos before it escalated further. The situation was quickly escalating. The man's taunts grew louder, and his anger became more apparent with every passing second. He paced back and forth, barking insults, while his dog, now fully alert, continued to growl, its ears flat against its head. The crowd had backed away, creating a small circle around the two of them and the guard, though many still watched from the distance, waiting to see what would happen next. The man was pushing the boundaries, deliberately trying to provoke a response, and it seemed as if he might succeed. His eyes locked onto the royal guard, and he raised his voice even more, shouting at the soldier with a sense of challenge. His words were pointed, aimed to get a rise out of the guard. He wanted the guard to flinch, to show any sign of weakness. Instead, the royal guard remained perfectly still, his posture as rigid as ever, his eyes still focused straight ahead. The man was visibly frustrated, his hands clenched into fists at his sides as he continued his verbal assault. But the dog was the real focus of attention now. It was no longer just barking. It was snarling, ready to lunge. The dog's muscles were tense, and it started to move forward, its eyes fixed on the guard, sensing an opportunity. The man gave another sharp command, urging the dog to approach, his voice filled with authority. The dog obeyed, taking slow, deliberate steps toward the guard. Its growl deepened as it neared, and its teeth were bared, ready to strike. The crowd gasped, some of them backing away even further, uncertain of what was about to unfold. The man stood behind his dog, a smug expression on his face, confident that the guard would break under the pressure. He had expected this moment, convinced that he would be able to humiliate the soldier in front of everyone. But the royal guard remained calm, showing no signs of fear or hesitation. With every step the dog took, the tension grew thicker. The crowd held their breath, waiting for the guard to make a move. Some whispered among themselves, wondering if the guard would defend himself or simply stand his ground. Would the dog attack, or would it sense the guard's power and hold back? The man's confidence seemed to be growing, but the guard's unwavering silence was starting to have an effect. The dog was now only a few feet away, its body coiled in preparation to strike. The man's face lit up with a twisted sense of triumph, believing that the guard would finally crack. But just as the dog lunged forward, something remarkable happened. The guard, who had been utterly still up until that point, took one small, yet significant step. His fingers tightened around the rifle at his side, and with a sudden, precise movement, he raised it slightly. In that split second, the man realized that the guard wasn't going to back down. The atmosphere shifted, and the dog's aggression seemed to falter. The man's smug grin began to fade, replaced by uncertainty. The royal guard's presence was powerful, like an immovable force, and it was clear that no amount of provocation was going to shake him. The tension hung in the air, and the crowd fell silent, watching in anticipation to see what would happen next. The moment hung in the air like a heavy fog, and everything seemed to slow down. The dog, now only a few feet away from the royal guard, stopped in its tracks, its body still tense, ready to spring. Its eyes remained locked on the soldier, the growl still rumbling deep in its chest. The man who had commanded the attack stood behind it, his expression one of arrogance, expecting to see the guard break. But instead of backing down, the guard's presence only seemed to grow stronger. As the dog's growl became louder, the royal guard's face remained calm, unmoving. His eyes didn't flicker, his posture stayed rigid, and there wasn't the slightest hint of fear. It was clear to everyone watching that the soldier was no ordinary man. His discipline was unmatched, his focus unwavering. Despite the dog's threatening stance, the guard showed no sign of backing away or preparing to defend himself in any way. It was as if the tension didn't even touch him. The crowd had grown even quieter now, their murmurs turning into a hushed silence. People were watching closely, unsure of what would happen next. Some began to move a little closer, drawn in by the gravity of the situation, while others took a step back, still uncertain of the outcome. The tension in the air was palpable, but all eyes remained on the royal guard. The man, frustrated by the lack of reaction from the soldier, continued to shout orders at his dog, urging it to move. He believed that by commanding his dog, he could force the situation to turn in his favor. His dog, however, seemed confused by the guard's unyielding stance. The animal had been trained to protect its master, but the guard's calmness was unsettling, almost as if the soldier wasn't affected by its aggression. The man's words grew more desperate, but the guard still didn't budge. The dog took a step forward again, but it hesitated. The royal guard's steady gaze met the dog's, and the animal's body tensed as if it couldn't quite decide whether to attack or retreat. The crowd was on edge, watching this strange standoff unfold, not knowing what would happen next. The guard's silence was a powerful thing. It wasn't just his stillness, but the way he seemed to project an invisible force of authority. Then, in one swift motion, the guard took a step back and raised the rifle in his hands, but only slightly. His finger didn't press the trigger, but the simple action made a loud, sharp noise in the air. The sound was enough to make the dog pause in its tracks, its growl fading slightly as it stopped moving. The dog's ears flicked back, and it looked up at its master for guidance, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. The man froze, his eyes wide with shock. He had expected chaos, but instead, the situation had taken an unexpected turn. The royal guard had shown no fear, no hesitation, and had handled the threat with an incredible amount of control. The dog, which had been so ready to attack, seemed confused now, its attention divided between the guard's unyielding calm and its master's increasingly frustrated commands. The crowd, still silent, seemed to collectively exhale. They had witnessed something remarkable, an individual standing firm against intimidation without even having to raise a hand. The man, now uncertain of what to do, looked around at the people watching, realizing that his attempt to provoke the guard had failed. His confidence began to fade, and the dog, now less aggressive, took a step back. The atmosphere, once thick with tension, started to clear as the man's hold on the situation slipped away. The royal guard's silence had won out. As the atmosphere began to settle, the man's posture shifted. His earlier confidence had been replaced with hesitation. The dog, which had moments before been snarling and ready to charge, now stood still, its eyes darting between its master and the royal guard. The growl had softened, and its body language suggested confusion. The guard, still standing firm and silent, had not moved an inch. His calm and composure had a magnetic effect, drawing the attention of everyone around. The man, still holding the leash, tried to assert control over his dog, but it was clear that the animal was no longer responding with the same aggression. The dog glanced back at its owner, as if uncertain about how to proceed. The tension had drained from the scene, and the crowd that had been anxiously watching was beginning to breathe again. People were starting to realize that the situation had shifted, but no one was exactly sure how or why. In the midst of this shift, the man's frustration boiled over. He tugged at the leash, trying to force the dog forward, urging it to act as it had before. But the dog was no longer interested in attacking the guard. It seemed to sense something in the air, the stillness, the quiet power radiating from the soldier. The dog's gaze remained fixed on the guard for a moment longer before it finally lowered its head, no longer barking or threatening. The man's attempts to force the situation were failing, and the reality of the situation was starting to sink in. The royal guard, for his part, had not acknowledged the man's behavior or the dog's presence. His eyes remained fixed straight ahead, his expression unchanged. It was almost as if he had completely ignored the provocation. His unshakable discipline was evident, and the crowd had grown increasingly in awe of his professionalism. No one could remember a time when they had seen such self-control in the face of provocation. The guard's stoic silence had been a force of its own, a powerful statement without a single word spoken. The man's frustration turned to anger as he realized his attempt to disrupt the guard's composure was failing. But instead of lashing out more, he seemed to shrink, his bravado melting away. He looked around, noticing that the people nearby were now paying more attention to him than before, but not in the way he had hoped. Instead of seeing someone who had forced a reaction, they saw a man who had been outmatched by the quiet strength of the royal guard. With his dog now calm and his moment of triumph slipping away, the man made a final attempt to regain control. He gave the dog another sharp command, pulling at the leash in one last, desperate effort. But the dog simply stood there, no longer interested in following his orders. It was clear to everyone that the animal had given up on the idea of attacking. The man took one last frustrated glance at the royal guard, his expression now filled with disbelief. He had pushed and prodded, expecting a reaction, but instead he had been met with an unflinching stillness. The power of that silence, the discipline in the guard's every action, had been enough to diffuse the situation. The man, realizing that his efforts had failed, turned away, his shoulders slumped, and began to walk off, his dog trailing behind him. As the man retreated, The crowd slowly started to disperse as well, their eyes still fixed on the royal guard. He had done what he was trained to do: stand strong, protect his post, and remain unwavering no matter what. The scene had ended without violence, but the impact of the guard's strength of character would stay with everyone who had witnessed it. The royal guard had won without a single word, and in doing so, had shown the power of calm, control, and discipline in the face of provocation. As the man walked away, dragging his dog behind him, there was a heavy silence in the air. The tension that had filled the street moments ago slowly began to lift, leaving a sense of relief in its place. The people who had been watching the scene unfold were left in a mixture of shock and admiration. The way the royal guard had handled the situation without uttering a single word, without showing any sign of fear or frustration, was nothing short of remarkable. It was as though the guard's strength had been his silence, and it had been enough to diffuse a potentially dangerous confrontation. The man, now walking with his head down, seemed to shrink under the weight of what had just happened. His earlier arrogance had vanished, replaced by a growing sense of humiliation. He had expected the royal guard to react, to move or say something, but instead, the guard had done the exact opposite. By not engaging, by remaining composed and still, the guard had shown that there was no need for words or actions to assert authority. The man's attempt to provoke the guard had backfired, and now, as he walked away, he couldn't help but feel the sting of his failure. The crowd, which had been so tense moments before, began to relax as well. Some exchanged glances, while others whispered among themselves, still processing the scene they had just witnessed. It wasn't every day that they saw someone stand so resolutely in the face of such open hostility. Most people would have reacted to the man's insults, to the dog's aggression, but not the royal guard. His response had been a perfect example of the strength that comes with patience and discipline. A few people quietly applauded the guard, though the sound was faint. It wasn't loud enough for the man to hear, but it was enough for the guard to know that the crowd recognized what he had done. He had stood his ground not because he was trying to show off or make a spectacle, but because it was his duty to do so. His job was to protect, to remain professional, and he had done just that. The man had thought he could disrupt the guard's composure, but in doing so, he had only drawn attention to his own weakness. As the crowd dispersed, some continued to talk about the incident. They couldn't believe how calm the royal guard had remained in such a high-pressure situation. Many admired his discipline and the way he had handled the situation without flinching. They wondered how the guard was able to stay so focused, how he could block out the man's insults and the threatening behavior of the dog. It was clear that the guard's strength was not just in his ability to stand firm, but in his ability to ignore distractions and focus solely on the task at hand. Meanwhile, the royal guard remained exactly where he had been, standing tall and still at his post. The only sign that he had been involved in the confrontation at all was the slight movement of his chest as he took a slow breath. He had not let the situation shake him. His focus was on his duty, and he was not going to let anything, not even a provocation like this, distract him from it. As the street returned to its usual bustle, the royal guard's calm continued to linger in the air. For those who had witnessed the incident, the memory of his strength, his ability to remain unmoved by anger and aggression, would stay with them. It was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all. The guard had shown that true strength lies not in confrontation, but in the ability to stand firm and let others realize that their actions will not sway you. The man had left in defeat, and the guard had remained victorious without lifting a finger. The royal guard continued to stand perfectly still at his post, unwavering in his duty. The street around him slowly returned to normal, as if the small drama that had just played out had never occurred. People resumed walking, chatting, and taking photos, going about their day as though nothing had disrupted the calm. Yet for those who had witnessed the tense confrontation, there was a lingering sense of awe in the air. The guard's remarkable composure had left an impression that would not soon fade. For the people who had seen the man try to provoke the guard, It was clear that the guard's strength was not simply in his uniform or his position. It was in his ability to remain untouched by the chaos around him. It was his silence, his stillness, that had not only diffused the situation, but had also commanded respect from those who watched. The man had tried to break the guard's composure, to force him to react, but he had failed miserably. In that moment, the guard had shown that true power doesn't always come from confrontation or force. It comes from the ability to control one's emotions and remain focused on the task at hand. Some people were still talking in hushed tones, marveling at the guard's ability to remain so calm. They couldn't help but compare his behavior to what they had expected. Most people would have reacted to the verbal abuse, or at least shown some sign of agitation when faced with an aggressive dog. But not the guard. His silence, his unwavering stance, had been a quiet but powerful form of resistance. He had made it clear that he would not be swayed by the man's insults, nor would he be intimidated by the dog's threatening behavior. As time passed, the man who had caused the scene continued to walk away, his head lowered. He no longer looked proud or defiant. The energy he had once carried was now gone, replaced by a sense of defeat. The crowd had witnessed his failure, and there was no going back for him. He had tried to provoke the guard, and in doing so, had lost whatever ground he thought he had gained. His attempt to humiliate the royal guard had backfired spectacularly. The guard, meanwhile, did not let the situation bother him. He remained focused on his duties as he always had. His job was not to engage in arguments or confrontations, but to stand vigilant and protect. The crowd could see that he took his responsibility seriously. His calm demeanor was a reminder that some situations required nothing more than poise and professionalism. The guard wasn't seeking recognition or applause. He was simply doing his job to the best of his ability. In the end, the royal guard's actions had spoken volumes. His ability to stay composed had not only diffused a potentially dangerous situation, but had also sent a powerful message to everyone who had been watching. It was a lesson in strength, patience, and discipline, one that left an impression on the crowd. For those who had witnessed the event, the memory of the guard's unshakable resolve would remain with them, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful response is the one that requires the least effort. The guard had won the battle without lifting a finger, and in doing so, had shown the true meaning of strength. The incident that had unfolded moments ago had already begun to fade from the minds of most, as life around the royal guard returned to its usual pace. The tourists walked along the cobblestone streets, the distant hum of the city blending with the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. People stopped to admire the architecture, the ornate statues, and the peaceful surroundings. But for a few, the memory of the quiet strength the royal guard had shown would stay with them for much longer. It wasn't just about what had happened, it was about how it had been handled, and the lesson that had come from it. The guard continued to stand at his post, the embodiment of quiet resilience. His uniform was still immaculate, his posture still impeccable. He had not sought recognition for his actions, nor had he wished for anyone to notice the silent battle he had just won. To him, it was simply part of his duty. It was what he was trained to do, and he had done it flawlessly. In a world that often sought loud and dramatic responses, the guard had shown that sometimes the strongest action is no action at all. For the onlookers, the lesson was clear. The man who had tried to provoke the guard had failed, not because he wasn't loud enough or didn't try hard enough, but because the guard had remained completely unaffected. He hadn't let the insults or the aggression of the dog disrupt him. He hadn't allowed the scene to become anything more than what it was. In a world where people often reacted impulsively, the guard had shown that true strength lies in self-control. The man had wanted a confrontation, a fight, but instead, he had been met with something far more powerful: indifference in the face of hostility. Some of the people who had witnessed the encounter began to talk amongst themselves, processing what they had seen. They shared their thoughts on how the guard had remained so calm, how he hadn't even flinched when faced with the man's taunts or the dog's aggression. It was a rare thing to see someone display such composure in the face of anger and provocation. It made many of them realize that they, too, could learn to be more like the guard, to remain calm when others sought to disturb their peace, to not let the negativity of others drag them into conflict. The guard had made them see that silence, when used properly, can be an incredibly powerful tool. As the crowd slowly dispersed, some of them took a final look at the royal guard before walking away. It was clear that his presence, his unwavering discipline, had made an impression on them. It wasn't just about the way he had handled the confrontation, but the way he had shown that composure, dignity, and restraint were more powerful than any words or actions. The man who had tried to cause trouble had walked away, defeated, and the guard had stood tall, unshaken. For the royal guard, the day had passed like any other. His duty was not to seek praise or recognition, but simply to serve and protect. As the crowds passed by, many of them unaware of the small battle that had just been fought and won, the guard remained at his post, focused and vigilant. His job was not glamorous or dramatic, but in that moment, he had shown that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from what you do, but from what you choose not to do. The lesson of that day stayed with everyone who had witnessed it. It was a reminder that strength is not always about confrontation or force. Sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is to remain calm, to stay focused, and to let your actions, or in this case, your stillness, speak louder than any words ever could. The royal guard had shown the power of resilience in the face of adversity, and in doing so, he had left a lasting impact on those who had been lucky enough to witness it.